How to Sew the Honeycrisp Mittens by Disparate Disciplines. Alrighty everybody, it's finally time to sew your mittens. To begin with, you're going to need to cut out your pattern pieces. If you need help finding the grain line on your conductive fabric, see yesterday's video on sewing with conductive fabric. As for the main fabric, I like to cut knits out on the right side of the fabric since it's easier to find the grain that way. I use the same method as discussed in the conductive fabric video. Now, the only word of caution when cutting out your pattern pieces is to be careful with the notches if you're clipping them instead of marking them. Make sure you don't cut past the seam allowance, which is 1/4 inch. Aside from that, the only other thing you need to do is mark the stitching line on the thumb. I find it easiest to mark it by sticking a pin through the pattern piece in fabric. Then, use that pin as a reference point for where you want to mark. Using carbon paper and a tracing wheel will be harder if you're sewing with a thicker fabric like fleece, which is why I like to mark using tailor's chalk. Now on to the sewing. Just remember though, you'll be using 1/4 inch seam allowance. The seam allowances are smaller than usual since the pattern pieces are so small. The first step in sewing the Honeycrisp mittens is to sew on those fingertips if you're making one of the conductive versions. You can just skip this little section if you're making one of the versions that's non-conductive. Now, if you're having difficulties lining up your fingertip pattern pieces with the palm pattern piece, grab a clear ruler and mark the stitching lines on your fabric. Then you'll easily be able to see where the pattern pieces line up. Once everything is lined up, sew the thumb tip and fingertip to the palm right sides together. After that, stitch the seam allowances down to the palm. Everything after this will apply to both the conductive and non-conductive versions of the pattern. Alright, so next we're going to stitch the palm to the back of hand right sides together. Please do not use a serger for this seam because the curves are much too tight. When sewing, line up the notch on the palm with the corners at the back of hand. The corners are at the narrowest part of the pattern piece, where your wrist will be. If making the forearm or upper arm length mittens, you'll also want to line up the notch on the back of hand with the stitching line at the tip of the palm. Once you've sewn the tip of the palm to the corner at the back of hand, you'll need to pivot your fabric. With the needle still in your fabric, lift up your presser foot. Pivot or shift the palm so that it lines up with the back of hand. Then you can lower your presser foot and continue sewing around the rest of the hand. When sewing, make sure you go slowly around the thumb, especially in the area between the thumb and fingers. There are some tight curves there, and your sewing will go much faster if you take your time instead of rushing and then having to rip out your stitches to redo everything. The other thing to keep in mind is that you may want to backstitch in the area between the thumb and fingers. You'll be clipping the seam allowance pretty close to the stitching line there, so you'll want to make sure it's reinforced. Now once you've made your way around the hand, you'll find you've sewn down to the other corner of the wrist. Again, you'll lift the presser foot while making sure the needle is still in your fabric. Then move the rest of the palm pattern piece over to line up with the back of hand. Start sewing again. If making the wrist length mittens, you'll just be sewing the palm to the back of hand. If you're making the forearm or upper arm length mittens, you'll sew the palm to the back of hand and then keep going past the tip of the palm so that you're sewing the back of the hand to itself. Essentially, you're creating a seam that will be concealed on the underside of your arm, just like the seam on a sleeve. After that, try on your mittens. I like to do this before turning it right side out. You'll want no more than about 1/8 inch of extra fabric at the fingertips. The extra bit of wiggle room is needed to accommodate the seam allowances. If things feel a little too loose or too tight, take your seam allowances in or out as needed. Once things are feeling good, trim your seam allowances down to 1/8 inch around the fingers. When you get to the area between the thumb and fingers, clip up approximately 1/16 inch to the stitching line. That will free the fabric from puckering and let your thumb move about more easily. Now you can flip your mittens right side out. Once that's done, it's on to the cuffs. Fold one of the cuffs in half so the short ends, which have the notches, meet. Sew those halves right sides together. Now your cuff will be a tube. Wrong sides together, fold half of the tube over the other half. Then line up the raw edges of the cuff with the raw edges at the opening of the mitten. Stitch the cuff to the mitten right sides together. If you're using really thick fabric, it may be difficult to feed all the layers through your serger. After that, flip the cuff down and iron your mitten. But I've got a confession to make. When sewing these in fleece, I usually skip the ironing. Other fabrics, though, really can benefit from a good press under a hot iron. Now, sew up your other mitten and you'll be ready to battle the elements. Well, how'd things go? I'd love to see photos of your finished mittens. Share them in the Honeycrisp Mitten section on the forums at disparatedisciplines.com or on social media with the hashtag Honeycrisp Mittens. Thanks for watching and happy sewing!